I think we're probably ready to start. So I'm going to mute everyone, and please don't, if you want to pitch in or ask a burning question, don't hesitate to unmute yourself. Um, okay. Oh, my relatives. I wanted to share some of the story of my time on the reservation, but I wanted to give some background on how I ended up going there. And I started out, I did not have the strength or the stamina or anything else. I was kind of a ne'er-do-well as a high school student, unmotivated. I got kicked out of a couple of nice schools. I was socially awkward and think I still am somewhat. But I've been incredibly lucky and to have kind of fallen into these ways. I after high school, I went off to become a philosophy and psychology major. And I think I started that pursuit in order to impress pretty girls who were also smart. But I became really interested in that philosophy and psychology and was going after it. There's an old Scottish, Welsh prayer that says, "From ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night, Lord, deliver us." And the things that go bump in the night was sort of an important part of that for me. I believed in science. I thought science could explain absolutely everything in this world. And I'm actually coming to think that perhaps in an expanded way it could. But I didn't believe in any of the psychic phenomenon or any of the other stuff. We had a fellow in our group named Ed, and Ed was a psychology major from Princeton and this really brilliant guy. And Ed claimed to be psychic, and I didn't believe in any of it. He would talk about witches' talismans and different things that he'd witnessed and psychic phenomenon. And I thought it was a bunch of hooey. But I never told Ed that because it was kind of entertaining. I could suspend disbelief and enjoy his stories. Well, this all kind of changed on my 21st birthday. Let me share the screen here. And on my 21st birthday, I got given a gift by a dear friend. And this was my rough drawing of it. It was a Nigerian coin purse or wallet. And it had two parts. There was the upper part that had what looked like arms and sort of a tongue or a head shape on it. And you'd pull that up on a heavy leather thong. And then the lower part had a flap you could lift up, and you could stuff things inside of it and then lower the top part onto the bottom part and then wear it around your neck. And this thing, I haven't drawn all of the detail of it, just sort of the outline of it. Had this super heavy leather thong. It was decorated with bright colors and shapes and different things. It was carved leathers. And I started wearing it, and I started getting really sick. It's like this thing was just dragging my energy down. Now, I had this perfect job as a college student. I was a garage attendant, which meant in the evenings from 6 to midnight, I could sit in the garage, and my presence there kept cars from being stolen. And I I was paid basically minimum wage to study, so it was a perfect college student job. So I was in this garage, and I sensed that I was getting really sick. And I think I associated it with this coin purse somehow, even though that didn't make any sense to me scientifically, and I believed in science first and foremost, and there would be no way to explain that. Well, excuse me. Well, at the same time that I had this coin purse, I also had a crucifix that did not mean a lot to me religiously, but this incredibly pretty girl had given it to me, and it looked something like this. It was a little more ornate than this. And I started wondering, because I remembered Ed talking about witches and witchcraft and everything, and I wondered if maybe this coin purse was made by a witch doctor. And so I thought, okay, well, you know, if it was made by a witch doctor, then I know that if I take this crucifix and I put it inside this coin purse, then when I close it up and set it on the table, it'll start jumping around, and then it'll start smoking, it'll burst into flames and be reduced to ashes, and the crucifix will be glowing, wow, 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 you know, because that's what would happen in a Hollywood movie. So I was bored, and so I stuck this crucifix in this coin purse, and as I was gently closing it, the heavy leather thong broke. And this kind of freaked me out because it had been something that had about pulled my head off when it had gotten yanked really hard. So it was a stout leather thong. And it was suddenly just rotted and had broken. So I thought, okay, I must have, being a psychologist, I must have pulled on it extra hard. So I tried to tie a knot in it. And when I did, the knot broke in another place. I tied 5 knots in it, and each time I tried to gently tighten a knot, it would break again. So I was wondering what the heck's going on. So I thought, okay, I better go and see this guy who's supposed to be psychic, this Ed fellow. And so I went over to Ed's house, his apartment, rang his doorbell, and he came down the stairs. And I stuck this coin purse in my coat pocket out of sight because I didn't want to give him any clue as to why I was actually coming over there. I just, you know, wanted, hey, Ed, just happy to see, happy-go-lucky Preston come to visit you. Well, Ed opened his door and smiled at me, said, Preston. And then I smiled at him, forcing this big smile on my face. And then suddenly his expression dropped from looking, you know, happy to see me. He suddenly looked horrified, and he looked right down at the pocket of my coat where this thing was out of sight. And I could see that he sensed something in my pocket. You know, I was going to go in and talk to him for a while and then say, oh, hey, what do you think about this? But I pulled this thing out, and he jumped back up a flight, you know, up backwards, and said, I saw death all around you, and it was coming from your pocket. And I was kind of freaked out by this and went, yeah, okay. And so he said, okay, don't freak out. He said, come on inside and we'll do something about this. And so he brought me into his apartment, and he said, let's figure out who made this thing. And so he took 4 candles and he put them on hardwood floors, and he put this thing in the middle of it. And he started pointing some things out. While all of the colors of the shapes and designs on this object, on this coin purse, were very bright and colorful, you couldn't explain that when you just looked at it, the object looked dark. And there was no explaining how it could look so dark when it was so brightly colored. And so we sat on the floor on either side of this. And he said, just focus on this and feel it. And then as we started doing that, it got really spooky in there. All 4 candles started strobing, going up and down, and there was an open window with a Venetian blind in front of it. And and the Venetian blind started banging against the window. The window was open about 4 inches or so, and the room got really cold, and there was this palpable presence in the room, and it was scary. And I said, Ed, this is, okay, I get that this is here. I said, now can we get rid of whatever this is in here? And he said, all right. He said, now focus on things that are life affirming and life giving. And, and push all of that energy into this object. He said, think of love and think of the Tao and think of Jesus and think of everything that you can think of, that's good, and push that energy into this. And as we did that, the candles stopped strobing and the room warmed up. It had felt like it had dropped 20 degrees. It warmed up. The Venetian blinds stopped banging against the window. And this was really messing with my belief system, because according to my belief system, none of this should have been possible, since I believed in science. And it's really tough having your belief system messed with. Well, after that, I learned that there was so much more than what science could say. I learned that, the spirit and all these different things are real. And that became my immediate focus. I wanted to learn more about that. Ed and I ended up becoming very close friends, and we moved in together, and we started going around and having different experiences. And at one point we came to the realization that Native Americans on this land had the most powerful spirituality that could be had in this continent. Maybe different in other continents, but here the Native American spirituality was the strongest. And we didn't know how to go about seeking that out and finding that. And so one night we got together and sat down and we made a prayer trying to call that into us, that whatever that knowledge was, that it would come to us, since we didn't know how to go out seeking it. Since we knew if you looked up for a medicine man on, in the yellow pages, we didn't have the internet back then, what you would find, wouldn't be someone you'd want to go to, since we knew that the real ones wouldn't be advertising. So we made this prayer, and a few days later, I was going through a library, and I saw a book on the shelf, and the spine of the book, it was the sacred pipe, and the design of the spine on the book, those geometric designs sort of reminded me a little bit of the designs on this coin purse that I had. Not that they looked dark or, but that they looked powerful. And when I pulled the book out and saw the designs on the cover, I thought, okay, maybe this is something, I should bring this home. Well, Ed was a speed reader, and he read the book in about 45 minutes, and he thought it was really cool, Black Elk, Oglala Sioux Medicine Man. And I took a day or two to read it, and I was impressed by it. We were both impressed by it. I was telling a friend about it, about this book, about this Oglala Sioux Medicine Man, and he was an anthropology major at Washington University in St. Louis. This all happened in the St. Louis area, which is where I grew up. And my friend said, oh, well, did you know that Frank Foolscrow, an Oglala Sioux medicine man and chief, is coming to Washington University in a couple of weeks? And I was like really surprised. And I thought, maybe this is, this might be, what Ed and I prayed for. And I researched and I found this poster. The gal who made the poster didn't have a picture of Frank Foolscrow, so she just got a picture of an Indian, probably a Southwest Indian, and used that on the poster. But this was pretty cool, and so I got the poster. I told Ed about it. We were both pretty excited about it. And this is what Frank Foolscrow looks like. Here's one of the pictures. And then here's another picture of Grandpa Foolscrow sitting at home. Kind of looks like he would sometimes look up like that. And I always wondered, like, he must be looking up at the spirits or something, making his connection. But so anyway, these talks were happening with Grandpa Foolscrow, and we were excited about this. So I was making flutes at the time out of bamboo, and I took the very first, or the best flute that I had made out of bamboo, and wrapped it in a clean white shirt. And I went to the very first talk that he gave in Brown Hall. Got there about an hour and a half early and went down and sat front row center and waited. Well, eventually the auditorium started to fill up, and I looked back and I saw the girl who had given me the crucifix. The crucifix didn't mean a lot to me religiously, but she had given it to me, and she was really pretty girl. And, so she meant a lot to me. And that's why I had the crucifix when I was in the garage that night. So Grandpa came in with Dan Clauser and Matthew King. He didn't speak any English. Matthew did all of his interpreting. But he gave his talk, and when the talk was over, I stood up and I looked back to see where this girl was going to go. Her name was Debbie. And when I looked back around, Chief Foolscrow had walked right up to me with his hand out to shake hands. And I gave him this flute, and shook his hand and gave him this flute. And that was how I met him. Later I told Ed, Ed couldn't come to that first meeting. Ed came to the second meeting, which was in Graham Chapel. Now, Graham Chapel is in Washington University. It's kind of this nice chapel, and seats about 700 people. And the second meeting with Grandpa Foolscrow was in this chapel. And Ed came to that meeting. And when Ed saw Grandpa Foolscrow, Ed said that he was so powerful that he couldn't even look at him. He thought that Chief Foolscrow was the most powerful person on the planet, spiritually powerful person on the planet. And he was just blown away. And so this sort of, I knew Grandpa Foolscrow was pretty powerful. And during this talk in Graham Chapel, at one point, Chief Foolscrow motioned me to come forward. And as I did so, he held out his hand and his wrist, and he started tapping his arm. And as he did this, there was a lump that appeared right on his wrist, about the size of a marble under the skin. And it came up, and there was this big lump there. And then he took his hand and he backed it up, and the lump went away. And Matthew King told me later that Grandpa Foolscrow had 7 sacred stones inside of his body, and that he was showing me one of those stones. Well, this was really something, and I was really impressed. We actually had Grandpa Foolscrow came to Ed's in my apartment with Matthew King, which kind of amazed both of us, and was, for us, this was the answer to the prayer that we had made about trying to learn about these ways. And when he was there, Grandpa Foolscrow gave me a root and instructions on how to use, turn it into a medicine bag. And so I did that and have that medicine bag still. One of the other talks that he gave, wait a minute here. Oh, okay, just a second. I'm going ahead of myself here. All right. I'm sorry. Folks, let me just a second here. Oh, okay. Lost some of my slides here. Okay, let me just a second here. He gave a talk, and there were some things that people asked him. He dressed up in his regalia, and people were asking him what's going to happen in the future. And Chief Foolscrow said that in the future, there would be a time when there would be a lot of death and destruction. And people asked, what should we do about that? And Grandpa Foolscrow's answer was pray. And then people asked, how should we pray? And his answer was, however you believe, pray that way. Now, also during the talk, Matthew King talked about that the medicine people are like hollow bones, where the rest of us are filled up with ourselves. I think he was a reference to the ego. The medicine people are empty, and because they're empty, the spirit can move through them. And Matthew King told us that the greatest teaching that Grandpa Foolscrow had, just a second here. Hold on here, I'm trying to get, all right. Sorry about this, folks. Here we go. So the other, Matthew King told us that the teaching that Chief Foolscrow gave most frequently was that we are always our own worst enemy, and that the spiritual path is all about us fighting our worst enemy, which is ourselves. I've spent the last 45 years, 10 months, and 26 days since hearing that message, trying to better understand that. Now, I don't know if I'm sharing the screen correctly or not here. I'm trying to get, there. Oh, yeah. All right, I think I've got it set now. So in January, Grandpa invited me to come and live with him. And so on January 6th, 1975, I hitchhiked to South Dakota. And it was tough. I don't advise hitchhiking to South Dakota in January. That's not a really good plan. But when I got up there, I was made welcome, even though it was a really hard time because Grandpa Foolscrow's grandson, who was a decorated Vietnam veteran, had been killed by Dickie Wilson's goon squad. And Grandpa was really in deep mourning, and he ended up going to the hospital. And so it was a tough time. I was trying to do everything I could while I was up there to be useful, chopping wood, hauling water, cooking, doing dishes. But eventually it felt like with Grandpa in the hospital, he had pneumonia. And it felt like I was more in the way than I was being helpful. And Grandpa told me, and I went down to the hospital to visit Grandpa. I decided to go back to St. Louis. Went to the hospital to visit Grandpa Foolscrow. And he told me to come back at Sundance time. Now, I was really surprised when I went into the hospital because over the bed of in the hospital, they had a sign with each patient's name and also a sign under that with their religion. And they showed Grandpa's religion as Catholic, which to me, that felt like if the Pope went into the hospital and they showed his religion as being Hindu, that just seemed really wrong. But, Grandpa did consider himself a Catholic. And so, that I learned that. And later, when I was living with him, if a priest or a nun would come by with communion, he and Grandma were always very glad to take that communion. Well, anyway, Grandpa told me to come back at the Sundance time. And so I got ready and I thought, all right, I want to know more about this. And so I decided to do a Sungleska on my own. I was back in St. Louis, didn't have any guidance, didn't know what on earth I was doing, but I found a remote area and I put myself up on a hill for 4 days and nights without food and water. I had a pup tent and I had a sleeping bag, so it certainly wasn't a traditional Sungleska, but I did the 4 days without food and water. And because I wanted to know that I could do that before I asked Grandpa Foolscrow to put me up on the hill. And along about the third day, I thought to myself, I wonder if I could Sundance. And so I tried to stand up and dance. And after 3 days with no food or water, I quickly gave up the idea of being a Sundancer. Well, I didn't know exactly when the Sundance Grandpa was referring to was happening, but I found this poster of CeeLo Black Crowes and that this Sundance was happening. And so I came up to the reservation at this time, a few weeks before this dance to CeeLo's and met CeeLo. And this was not very long after the 2 FBI agents were killed outside of Oglala. And we had some of those big helicopters still buzzed CeeLo's house. I guess on the day that the 2 FBI agents were shot in Oglala, CeeLo had a bunch of visitors at his house. Now, CeeLo's house was about 100 miles away from Oglala, and CeeLo didn't have a telephone, didn't have a television set, no phone, no television set. No one had any idea that the 2 FBI agents had been shot or that anything was happening at all. And a bunch of visitors, and suddenly a big helicopter came and hovered down near CeeLo's place. I wasn't there at the time, this was earlier. And all of these federal marshals started diving out of the helicopter with M16s and started crawling and approaching CeeLo's house. And CeeLo grabbed a tray and he told all of his visitors, he said, take your rings and your watches and your wallets and everything of value and put them on this tray. And then as the marshals got closer to his house, CeeLo opened the door and he shoved this tray out with his foot coming out with his hands up. And he said, this is all we have, take it and leave. And the marshals were like, oh, well, we're not here to rob you, we're here to terrorize you. Well, that wasn't what they said, but they said, we're not going to rob you. Well, they tore apart CeeLo's sweat lodge and they called it a bunker, though, I don't know how that would be much of a bunker. And when I was up there, at one point I was staying in one of the log cabins that CeeLo had. And CeeLo told us, hey, we're going to have a medicine ceremony here. And Robert Steed's the medicine man. And in the cabin I was staying in, he told us to get it ready. And we took all of the furniture out of the cabin, took the wood stove out, covered the stovepipe with a coffee can, made up a mud plaster, and plastered up all of the cracks in the logs so that no light could come in. Figured we're also winterizing this for CeeLo, which was glad to do. And it was a warm hot summer day, and it was a warm summer night. And we got the cabin completely light-tight and light-proof. We nailed blankets and rugs over the windows, hung stuff over the door. And the ceremony took place at night. And Robert Steed came in, and Willard Pipeboy was his singer. And I didn't know that at the time. I heard the name, but didn't mean anything to me. And Robert Steed was this mousy little man. You know, he just, you know, he's the last person you wouldn't look at him and go, wow, that must be a powerful medicine man. But that was sort of the point, is that he was this very humble and very quiet little man. And he came in and he set up his altar. And he took out a coffee can with Gopher Hill dirt, and he poured a mound of dirt on the floor, and then took a board and flattened it out into a circle, and then took an eagle feather and drew a design in it that the spirits had showed him. And the Willard and the singers started singing, and he filled his pipe and I believe gave it to his wife to hold. And then they had put tobacco ties all around this altar area and flags, the 4 directions. And then when they were ready, they turned out the lights. It was completely pitch black in there. And the singers started singing these calling songs. And even though at this point, you know, I believed in God at this point. I was no longer, you know, believing only in science. So things started happening in there. There were these lights, and I started hearing a rattle that was going around, and there were these lights that were moving, blinking all around in this lodge. And I kept, you know, even though I believed in all of these things, I kept wondering, you know, how are these men doing this? You know, how can they do this and not run into people? Because we had about 50 people in this tiny log cabin. We were all sitting cheek to cheek around, and you know, they would have to go around and not run into any of us. And so I kept coming up with wild explanations for all of the things that I was witnessing. I'd hear bells, I'd hear these gourds, and all this stuff happening all around me and moving past me, and yet not running into me. And my explanations kept becoming more and more implausible. And at one point, I witnessed an eagle that flew, or heard an eagle fly, what sounded like an eagle fly across the room from one wall all the way to the other, bang, and then flew back. And I thought, well, that's too fast for anyone to have run, you know, and I thought maybe they have an eagle wing on a long pole, but nobody brought any poles in. So I was really confused how this could be happening and how these guys could be doing this. And it was a really warm summer night. And as it was getting very sweaty in there, and all at once this blast of ice cold air hit me. And I breathed in through my nostrils, through my nose, and it froze the inside of my nose in the way that that can happen if you're in a super, super cold environment. And if it hadn't been for the crinkling inside my nose, I probably would have tried to dismiss it as I was just very hot and they fanned me and it felt cool. But I couldn't dismiss that freezing air. And at that point, I knew that it was all real. And I started silently praying, to Tankashila, thank you for showing me what an idiot I am. Well, Robert Steed's ceremony was a Lawampi. Now, Lawampi, the word Lawampi literally means we sing. And it's the word that was used, it was a code word back in the day, instead of calling them medicine ceremonies, because people would get in trouble with the church if they were having medicine ceremonies. So they would just say, hey, are we singing? Yeah, we're going to sing. So Lawampi became the term for these medicine ceremonies. Now, I went, that was my first Sundance, and I didn't go to Grandpa Foolscrow's Sundance, was in Pine Ridge that year, because I got my dates and everything mixed up. But I went and saw Grandpa, and there was this thing that I noticed Grandpa would often do. He would look at me with this stare that was like this piercing stare. And I just had the impression that like he had just opened me up and was looking inside of me, and that he could see every single thing about me. There was no secret that I had that he was not privy to, and I knew that. And then he would look away. It wasn't an angry stare. It wasn't, he never said anything about it, but he would do that sometimes. Well, one time when I was at Grandpa's there, and there were some other men there, and they were talking about Sundance, Grandpa turned to me and he said, Takoja, are you going to dance? With this big smile on his face. And I thought, oh crap, because I had sort of decided after trying to stand up and dance after 3 days of Humblecha that maybe Sundancing wasn't for me. I didn't really have the stamina or the strength. But, Grandpa was looking really excited at me as though, wanted me to dance. And so I thought, I don't want to say something that would commit me. I don't want to say yes, and I don't want to say no. So I said, oh, Grandpa, I could. He said, oh, washtelo. And he gave this sign, Indian sign that means yes, but it felt like gotcha. And so I thought, okay, Grandpa really wants me to Sundance. And I trust this old man. If he wants me to Sundance, then I have to try to Sundance, and I thought, I didn't think I'd have the stamina or the strength to do it. But I thought maybe I'm supposed to try and fail utterly, and maybe that would be what would be best for his people, to see me try and fail. So I was ready to try to Sundance, even if I didn't think I could pull it off. Well, Grandpa took me. Now, I didn't know enough to even know that I didn't know what questions to ask. Like, I didn't know how people got dressed at the dance, whether there were, skirts that were brought. I didn't know to get a skirt and to get a medallion and to get all of the things. But Grandpa took me up to Greengrass, and he asked them to let me dance up at Greengrass. And they said no, but they had a midnight dance or a late night dance up at that Sundance, and they let me go out and dance out in the arbor during the midnight round. But Grandpa spoke for me to Sundance, and you know, and they weren't having it anyplace. Well, the next year, and I went to another ceremony at that Robert Steed had, that was at Silos. And during that medicine ceremony, at one point in the pitch dark, they told all of us, stand up and dance. And they said that we were doing the ghost dance. And they said that Chief Rain in the Face had come in to the ceremony house and was dancing the ghost dance with us. And so we all stood up and we all danced with Chief Rain in the Face in the dark there. And after that Lawumpi ceremony, Robert Steed said to me, they don't want you to Sundance with them, but Chief Rain in the Face was glad to ghost dance with you. And that moved me a lot. Well, the next year I went to the Sundance at Silos, but I also went to the Sundance that was in Porcupine, where they had moved the dance from before. And they wouldn't let me dance there, even though Grandpa spoke for me to dance. And while I was there, before the dance started, I met a man named Dawson No Horse, and he was an Episcopal minister. And he was dressed in the black pants and the black shirt, and looked, like a man certainly looked like a man of the cloth. And he was really friendly to me, and I really liked him a lot. And at one point, I asked him if he would translate something to Grandpa Foolscrow for me. And he said yes. And so we went over to see Grandpa, and Dawson told him in Lakota that I had asked him to translate. And so I told Dawson what I had seen that I wanted to ask Grandpa about. And without even saying a word to Grandpa, Dawson told me, he said, when you eat a meal, you should take a little bit of the meat from your plate and go outside and dig a small hole and bury that and offer that back to Grandmother Earth. And I said, thank you for telling me that. I'll do that. But could you ask Grandpa Foolscrow what he says? So he talked Lakota to Grandpa. Grandpa talked Lakota back to him. And he said, that's what Grandpa says to do. And I said, okay, good. Well, later, when the dance was going on, during the dance, Dawson, who hadn't previously had anything to do with the Indian religion, he was an Episcopal, although he was a full-blooded Lakota, was in the shade arbor with his wife, Emily, and it was between rounds, and he nudged Emily and said, do you see that man out there dressed the old way? Half his face was red, half his face was black, half his hair was loose, half his hair was braided, and he was wearing an old leather skirt. And Emily said, there's no one out there. I think you've been in the sun too long. And Dawson said, no, he's calling me. I have to go out there. And with that, Dawson got up and walked straight out into the middle of the arbor up to the tree where this man was, where he was calling him. Now, this is a man in black pants. He's a preacher. Like the preacher suddenly walked up to the Sundance tree. And of course, everyone was kind of horrified seeing him do that. And when he got up to where that man was, the man just disappeared. And Dawson was shocked. And he looked around and he saw Chief Foolscrow walking out and walking up to him. And Chief Foolscrow announced to all of the people, said, "This is the man who's going to run the Sundance next year." And everyone was really shocked because, you know, this was the Grandpa, who was Catholic, had given the dance to the Episcopal minister. And well, after that dance, Dawson kept hearing that man's voice. He'd hear thunder, and the man he had seen out in the middle, whose name was Chanupa Gluhamani, he would hear his voice and hear him crying out, "Hey, hey!" And he became really freaked out. He was afraid he was going to get struck by lightning. He went into his Wakpamani Lake Episcopal Church, and he knelt at the altar, and he prayed, and boom, hey, hey! He knew he wasn't safe anywhere. And so finally he went to his wife and said, "This is driving me crazy. I have to go up on the hill. I'm going to be gone for 4 days. If anyone comes looking for me, you know, just tell them I went to Denver or something, you know, and I'll come back." So he went up on the hill. I don't know if he took a pipe up or not, but he took a sack of Bull Durham tobacco and he just made 4 little piles of tobacco in the 4 directions. And he stood in the middle and he waited. And he was there for 3 days, 3 nights. And that 3rd night, he said it was terrible. It was hot. He thought he was going to die. That 3rd night, a storm blew in and lightning struck right in front of him. And that man ran down the lightning and stood in front of him and told him, said, "You have 2 choices. You could choose the holy shawl or you could choose the thunder. Choose fast." And he understood him to mean that you could choose the holy shawl and become a Yuipi medicine man, or choose the thunder and get struck by lightning and killed. And so he said, "I'll take the holy shawl." And he said, "Aho, washte." And he disappeared again. And the next morning, the sun came up, went back down, came up, went back down 4 times. And the 4th time that it came up, it made a ring around it and or a diamond shape around it and a cross in the middle of that. And Dawson knew that he was supposed to use that symbol in his Yuipi altar. And so Dawson started having Yuipi ceremonies. He had that vision that he had seen of the sun with that shape around it, put on a black-tailed deer hide, and started having Yuipi ceremonies. And eventually I ended up going to his Yuipi ceremonies, and more on that later. But so anyway, back at the dance, after the dance, they would have, at that time, they'd have 4 days of Sundance and then have 4 days of powwow afterwards. And during the powwow time, while that was all going on, a man named Luther Highhorse came up to me because everyone knew that Grandpa wanted me to dance, and asked, "Do you want to dance?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, come with me." I think he had talked to Grandpa. And so I went with him, and he found out that I was completely unprepared. And Luther Highhorse took me to his house in Wambly, and he and his family made me a skirt. They decorated it. They got me a medallion to wear. They got me an eagle bone whistle. They got me everything I needed, the sage anklets and wristlets and the crown and everything, an eagle bone whistle. And they brought me over to Leonard Crow Dog's And Bill Schwagman was running the dance that year because Leonard was in the penitentiary. And we arrived on the 5th at the end of the first day. And Luther Highhorse, who, by the way, if any of you knew Al Highhorse, Luther was his uncle. So Luther talked to Bill Schwagman, Chief Eaglefeather, and told him that, I was the fellow that Grandpa wanted to have dance. And so Bill Schwagman said, okay, there's the dancer's tent, go put your bedroll in there, and then, come out in the morning, you're going to dance. And so I did that, and I sundanced that year at Crow Dogs. Now, I'd like to tell you I danced real strong and everything, but, I barely got through it. I wasn't that strong of a dancer, but, I made it through. I didn't quit and toughed it out. And so anyway, that was my first dance. So after that, I started attending Dawson's Uweepi ceremonies. And there was a fellow who named Eugene Yellowboy, and that's Eugene Yellowboy there. That's me. This was actually during my wedding reception when I got married to Hindi. We had a powwow after our wedding, and that's Eugene in the plaid shirt. And Eugene was kind of Dawson's main helper, and he also would sing for Dawson unless John around him came to the dance. And eventually I ended up singing with Eugene, so that Eugene and I were Dawson's helpers, and we would help tie Dawson up and put him in the altar. But whenever John around him came, Eugene and I would kind of defer to John because he was such a really good singer. And Dawson had some really powerful Uweepi ceremonies. You'd have a sweat beforehand, and sometimes they would bring in hot rocks and close up, and there'd be enough heat in the rocks, they'd be glowing enough that you could see other people in the lodge from the glow of the rocks. And Dawson would pick up a bundle of sage, and he would hit the rocks with that sage, and there'd be a bright white spark, and all of the rocks in that pit would turn this bright blue color, and top, bottom, sides, all around. And a little piece of sage would fall on the rocks, and it would still glow red as it burned, but the rocks themselves were this beautiful shade of blue. Well, Dawson ended up giving me the name Shunka Presto. He said, because Lakota people, that PR sound is it's hard for the Lakota people to say. So Dawson would say that, Preston. He said, I can't say that, that's a Washichu name. So I'm going to call you Presto, because that's easy to say. Shunka Presto, or a sharp dog, or a hound dog. And Grandpa also gave me a name later. Grandpa gave me the name Nawizipi, which meant jealous of him. And I guess there were some people who were jealous of me, which was kind of surprising because I was pretty pathetic. But anyway, we went on, and in in the dance at Porcupine in 1977, that was the next year, Dawson had, by that time of that dance, was a full-on Yuipi medicine man, but he still was the Episcopal minister. So in the Episcopal churches, Dawson would talk about the Chanupa and the ceremonies, and inside up and tied up in the blanket in the Yuipi, he would talk about Jesus. So for him, there was no difference. They were both the same thing. So the following year at that Sundance, before the Sundance started, the subject of whether I should be allowed to dance came up, and they had a meeting. And both Dawson and Grandpa Foolscrow spoke for me to be allowed to dance. But the dancers decided no, they didn't want to have a white man dancing with them. And so I wasn't allowed to dance that year. Now, they had the powwow afterwards, and during the powwow, one of the powwow dancers, who was one of the headmen, who had said that I should not be allowed to dance, fell down and had a heart attack. His name was John Attackham. And everyone drove pickup trucks, but I had a Volkswagen van that had a bed in the back of it. And since nobody had cell phones back in the day, I went and got my van and brought it in so that we could load John Attackham up and take him to the hospital. And I drove him to the hospital in my green van. We got him into the hospital and they worked on him, but they couldn't save him. But the following year, everyone remembered that that after John Attackham had spoken against me dancing, I had tried to save his life. And now I didn't know who he was, and I didn't know that he had spoken against me. And of course, it wouldn't have made any difference. He needed to get to the hospital. I was the only one with a vehicle that could take him. So, but they allowed me to dance the next year in 1978. And so that was good. There are three stories that I like to share about pieces of information that I was given about going on the hill. And it applies to sundancing, I think, as well. The first was from CeeLo Blackcrow. And he talked about going on the hill. And he said, when you go on the hill, he said, you expect four things. First, you expect to die up there. And some have. And I knew that a part of it is a part of us has to die up there. Our ego has to die if we're going to do it right. And he said, the second thing is that you expect to go crazy up there. And that's happened as well. And I also knew that when we go up on the hill, we have to let go, completely let go of everything, including our sanity. And that it can feel like we're going crazy up there. And he said, the third thing that can happen is that you can disappear. When they come to get you, there'll be nothing. You'll just be completely gone. And he said, and that's happened as well. And I knew that when we go up there, if had that chance, we could leap into that void and disappear as we let go of our egos. So that is something that could happen. And he said, and the fourth thing you expect is to come back down. Now, Pete Swiftbird gave some advice. He said, Presto, when you go up on the hill, he said, if a mole comes to you and says, I have a gift for you, he said, tell it no. And he said, and if a buffalo comes to you and says, I bring you some medicine, he said, tell it no. And he said, and if an eagle flies down and says, I will be your helper, he said, tell it no. He said, say no to all of these things and hold out for God. Tankashila. And I knew, it occurred to me that, because it sounded like, wow, that sounds like strange advice, but that I remembered that when Jesus went up and fasted, he was tempted. And when Buddha sat under the bo tree and fasted, he was also tempted, given temptations. And so we don't go up on the hill to get something. We go up on the hill to let go of something, to let go of our egos, and to lose that part of ourselves. And the last bit of advice that I was given was from Grandpa Foolscrow, who said, when you go up on the hill, he said, you could be there for 5 minutes and they could come to you. It doesn't matter how tired you are. It doesn't matter how thirsty you are or how hungry you are. It only matters is that you are ready to receive them. And so that was the advice that I was given. Here's another picture from, this was also taken during the wedding reception that Hindi and I had. And there was an interesting fellow, this fellow on the right here with the blue ribbon shirt was a German man, and he's a medical doctor. And I met him and he was really humble and I really liked him. And I invited him to come to Dawson's medicine ceremony, Uipi ceremony. And he came and he asked Dawson, he said, can I ask you a question before we start? And he told Dawson, he said, I have this bag of small stones that I use in my medical practice. And these stones talk to me and tell me what to do to heal the person. And he said, is it okay if I have these stones in this ceremony with me? And Dawson told him, yes. He said, in fact, why don't you hang those stones on the West flag and the spirits will bless them. And he did that. And after the ceremony, Dawson told all of us that when the spirit came around that bag of stones, those stones were speaking Eashicha, which is the Lakota word for German. So those stones were all speaking German. So Dawson told all of us that this man really indeed was a medicine man. You know, he had that connection. Oh, and by the way, the fellow on the left side in the navy blue, if any of you recognize him, that's Linus Redfeather. There's another the fellow over there, this fellow is Charlie Garriott. And this is Albert Whitehat here, and Marlise Whitehat, his wife, sitting next to him with all their kids around them. And Charlie and Albert and Hindi and I, and we were all members. We had made a little kind of a gardening co-op along with a fellow named Ron Goodman, and for growing native plants. And there was one other picture I brought. We had heard that there were Buddhists who were coming to the reservation. They were doing a long walk from California to Washington, D.C., and they were coming through the reservation in the middle of the winter time. And it was when they came through, I was driving to Denver one time, and I saw them on the highway walking, and they had a caravan of people, of vehicles following them. And in front of those vehicles, there were people in parkas, because it was like 20 below and wind chill was down to like -50. So it was absolutely freezing cold outside. And all of these people out in front who had on parkas and ski masks, they had long frost beards hanging off of their parkas. And out in front of them was a man with bare hands and dressed in an orange robe with his face completely exposed. He had a little tiny cap on top of his head. It was this man here, and the gal behind him was his interpreter. He spoke Japanese, but his head was completely exposed in that bitter cold, and he was praying and chanting and marching across, and we met with him, and I brought some elders. I couldn't get Grandpa Fool's Crow, but I got Moses Big Crow to come and talk to him, so that was good. One of the things that I've seen is that all of the medicine people I've ever met, the one thing that they seem to all have in common, and all of the people who make these spiritual connections, is their absolute humility. Sometimes people would ask me when I was at Grandpa's, do you want to have power like Grandpa's? And I would say, the thing that I would like, if I could have it, that Grandpa has, is his humility. That's, I want to learn that. And it feels like that humility is the path we need if we're going to get closer. And as a means of doing that, but the problem with humility is to gain humility usually involves a great deal of humiliation. That's not a lot of fun. We would much rather have a spiritual practice that made us feel great and wonderful and powerful. But it seems like when we're doing it the right way, we end up, it doesn't make us feel good. It makes us feel kind of sad and debased, which is kind of weird. Is something I call the righteousness paradox, that the more we think that we feel connected and spiritually, like we're doing really great, that's usually when we're going the wrong direction. And the more we feel kind of brokenhearted and like we're screw ups and all of that, that's usually when we're on the right path. We see our world nowadays, and it's going crazy. That we have a president who's trying to divide us, and whether we're in support of him or not, there's this infection of anger and hatred that is going. And one of the things that I try to do, and I try to remember, and I think is useful, is that if I was Donald Trump, if I had been born into Fred Trump and experienced all of the things that Donald Trump has experienced, I don't know that I wouldn't be doing the exact same thing that Donald Trump is doing. So it's, I can't hate Donald Trump, or can't hate Joe Biden, or, all of us could be like that. And one of the things that I like, Carl Rogers tells us that each person does the very best that they can with the tools at their disposal. So, when we see someone who's screwing up, instead of judging them, we can say, hey, maybe they don't have the tools that they need, and maybe, we can help them with that. And that seems like really good advice for us to use in the family if we're seeing someone who we think is not doing great. Let's hold on to them, and let's recognize that could very well be us, and that maybe they just need better tools. The Grandpa's teaching about that, the enemy, that we are our own worst enemy, is one I've been studying, because it's easy to dismiss that teaching and just think that that means, oh, well, we oppose our own best interests, and just dismiss it. But I think it's a great deal deeper. And this is kind of a corollary that I have to that teaching, that we should not seek the enemy outside of ourselves until we have conquered the enemy inside of ourselves. Because the external enemy is almost invariably merely a reflection of the internal enemy. And when Grandpa says, that we are our own worst enemy, how we should deal with that, we should remember the song, it's a veterans honoring song, Kola Tokawa, Nata Uelo, which is my friend the enemy. And so, who's coming to attack me and count coup on me? My friend the enemy. And so we need to see ourselves as our friend the enemy as well. And that would help. Well, anyway, I'm sorry this has been a really kind of rambling. I tried to prepare, but probably wasn't as good as it could have been. And that's that. If people want to unmute themselves, if anyone has any questions, I'm sorry. I hope this wasn't too disappointing a talk.
Pesto.
Yeah.
This is Steve Coyote.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, I just wanted to say thank you. Wopila Tonka. Some of those people you mentioned are people I knew too. CeeLo and Robert Steed and some of the other folks too. And I want to thank you for reminding me of those people again. And you did a good job.
Thank you.
Presto.
Oh.
Hi, it's Linda.
Hi.
Hey, I thought I heard you suggest that you were going to tell us a story about a Yoweepee that we didn't get to.
Ah, Dawson's Uwipis were really powerful. When Dawson would be in his Uwipi, he had that he did some things differently. Often he would have flesh offerings before the Uwipi started. And anyone who wanted to donate flesh to pray for the person who was sick was welcome to come up and give flesh offerings. And then inside Dawson's altar, he also had a pipe rack. And people, when the Opachi song was sung and Dawson filled his pipe, everyone who brought their pipes would fill their pipes at the same time. And we would hand all of the pipes into the center. And Dawson would put all of those pipes on the pipe rack inside of his altar so that the spirits would come by and bless those pipes. And when Dawson's ceremonies would start, his spirit would come around, and sometimes, depending upon what would happening, his spirit would come and would grab your wrist. It's like it knew exactly, it's pitch black, and it would grab your wrist and pull your hand up to touch one side of his head or the other. And you would either touch the side of the spirit's head where the hair was braided or the side of the spirit's head where the hair was loose. And depending upon which side of his head he had you touch, Dawson would later interpret what that meant and let us know. And there were times when there was one time especially, and of course the spirits would come all around in Dawson's altar and a lot of stuff happening. And I remember one time, and Dawson also, if any of us were sun dancers, he would tell us to bring our eagle bone whistles because his main helper, his spirit, is named Chanupa Gluhamani, who walks with his pipe, and he was a sun dancer spirit. And he would tell us, bring your eagle bone whistles. And then if we sang a Sundance song during the ceremony, we would stand up in the dark there and blow our eagle bone whistles and dance with Chanupa Gluhamani. And so that would happen. And one time a buffalo came into the ceremony house, and we were singing a Sundance song, and I was standing up and I was blowing an eagle bone whistle in the pitch dark, and this buffalo head came up and pressed against my stomach, blowing hot, moist air out of its nostrils. And it was this hairy buffalo head. And then moved on. But so Dawson's ceremonies were really powerful. And when he would put people up on the hill, by the time, he would have them in ceremony, and then after ceremony, he'd take them up and put them out in an area up on top of his property where he had these very tall sand hills. And he would make their hochokas. And when he was done, he would take, they would have the flags in the four directions. And he would take a bundle of sage and he would go around and he'd go, hoo-hoo, boom, and he'd hit the side of one of the flags with that bundle of mugwort. And there'd be this bright white spark when he did that. And, at one point he had asked me, can you go and get some of that mugwort? And he had me go and get a bundle of mugwort, and I brought it back to him, and he took some of that, was going hoo-hoo, and creating these sparks when he was blessing the flags when they were going up on the hill. It was pretty interesting stuff. It was pretty impressive. Any other questions?
Hi, Dad.
Hey,
This is Carrick.
hey, Carrick.
Thanks so much for these stories. I remember once you talked about a story where Grandpa used the fan to get a nail out of somebody's neck. Was that a story that
Yes,
you shared today?
I did not share that today, but I knew this from, there was a PhD historian who would hang out with Grandpa sometimes, and I got to know him. We became friends, and you know, I trusted him. He was a straight up, you know, fellow and friendly, and not a bullshitter. And he told me about going up with Grandpa Foolscrow to Rapid City to a meeting that was being held in the building. And when they went inside, there's something in another part of the building where they were doing renovation, and there were some white workers who were in there, and they were hanging sheetrock on the ceiling. And one of the workers, white workers, had dropped a nail and had gone down his throat, and he was choking on that. And they had called an ambulance. He could barely breathe, and all of his buddies had gotten him, and they'd tried pounding on his back, and they had tried getting 6 of them to hold him up by his ankles in the air and try to shake him to get that nail out, and it wasn't working. And the ambulance was on its way, and my friend said that Chief Foolscrow pulled out an eagle wing fan and walked up to the man and took out the fan, and he tilted the man's head back, and he started tapping him with the eagle wing fan on the neck of this white man. And my friend said that he saw a lump there, and then a nail came out. No cut, no blood, just popped out of his neck. And the man started breathing normally. And when the ambulance came, there was no reason to haul him off. But the amazing thing for me was, and it's one of the reasons I actually had a hard time with the books about Grandpa Foolscrow, because Grandpa never talked about any of that stuff. He would never tell that story about having done that. His humility was such that the only way I would learn any of those things was by hearing about them from other people. The humility was so amazing that it was, to me, it seemed more impressive even than the miracles that I witnessed and the healings that I witnessed. It's interesting, there was one man, there was a white man actually who ended up getting an altar. His name was Steve Lawrence. When I had first gone to Pete Swiftbird's house, Dawson Nohorse took me there, and Dawson told me that Pete was a Heyoka. And as we went to Pete's house, Dawson told me, you see that bluff over there on the far side of the creek at the edge of Pete's property? And he said, whatever you do, he said, don't go up there and humblecha. He said, people who have gone up there and humblecha, you know, have died. You know, it's not a good place to humblecha. So I said, okay, Dawson, thanks. You know, I won't do that. And I ended up staying with Pete Swiftbird for a period of time, and he had a cabin out on his land that I stayed in, and I renovated, put sheetrock up on the ceiling and insulation, and brought in a wood stove and all. And Pete once asked me, he said, do you know a man named Steve Lawrence, a white man who's very cross-eyed? And I said, no, I don't know him. Well, I learned the story about Steve Lawrence. Pete Swiftberg told me about putting Steve Lawrence up on the hill. And later up at Pilot Rock Sundance, I met Steve Lawrence. And Pete told me that he had put him up on the hill on that bluff where Dawson said, don't humblecha up there. And Steve told me about Pete putting him up on that hill there. And he said that he was up there praying with his pipe and a thunderstorm came in and lightning was striking all around him. And he was holding his pipe and he was thinking to himself, it's a really good thing that these Wakiya are up here because nobody's going to be stupid enough to come up here and mess with me, while I'm praying, because they'll be afraid of the lightning. He was worried about somebody messing with them. And as he was holding his pipe, he was seeing static electricity going up the stem of his pipe, zzz, 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 and he kept praying there. And said the rain just came and totally drenched him, just soaked him. His blanket was completely soaked. And then the rain went, the clouds parted, and the sky was full of stars. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and he could see all the stars. And then he saw a light coming up the road towards him up on this hill, and he became afraid. And so he got down really low, hoping that they wouldn't notice him. But it was a pickup truck, and it pulled up right next to his altar. And so he popped his head up, and it was Pete Swiftberg, and he said, "Oh, you're alive!" And so Pete Swiftberg went to the back of his truck and pulled out some visqueen, some plastic, and threw it into him and said, "Here, boy, cover up. You might get wet." And Steve said, "Yeah, thanks, Pete." Well, when I came out and was to Medford and went up to Pilot Rock, I met Steve Lawrence. And at one point, Tim Lopato and Steve and I went down because we had heard about a medicine woman down in California, and we wanted to go down and pray with her. Well, it was kind of a bust because she was charging people for sweats, and it turned out that she had mooning women coming into the sweat lodge, they stayed dressed when we were there, which we were thankful for. But we had heard that they usually, I think they sweat naked sometimes. But in any event, during that time and during that trip, I kept seeing the Spirit working with Steve. It wasn't, and I don't have any special sight. This wasn't me perceiving this on some deep spiritual level. It's just that I had been around, spent a lot of time around Dawson and Grandpa, and I knew what it looked like when the spirits were working with someone just from having been around them that much. And I started seeing this happen with Steve. Well, my wife Hindi had a cough that winter, and she went to see the doctor. And the doctor said, "Well, let's just do a chest x-ray." And so he did a chest x-ray, and it turned out that she had Hodgkin's lymphoma, cancer, and that her lungs were being affected by this huge tumor in her chest that they said was the size of a Nerf football. It was this big thing, and it was And if they didn't take care of it pretty quickly, that it would shut off her superior vena cava and close it off, and she would just die. And they did a CAT scan of her, and they showed the CAT scan showed of her entire body showed that there were a number of tumors in her liver. And that was very concerning because that would mean it was a stage 4 cancer. And so they wanted to know, were those tumors in her liver, were those Hodgkin's tumors, or were they a different type of tumor? And so this was on a Thursday. So they scheduled a CT guided needle biopsy for the following Tuesday. And that weekend, that Friday, I drove out to Coos Bay where Steve was living because I had seen the Spirit start to work with him. And I brought my pipe and I filled my pipe and I offered it to him. And I said, I want you to come and do a medicine ceremony for Hindi. And he said, Pesto, I'm no medicine man. I don't know anything about doing a medicine ceremony. And, you know, that's not me. I'm not a medicine man. And I said, Steve, I'm not asking you to succeed, but I've seen Spirit working with you. So I'm just asking you to try. I'm just asking you to come and make the prayers. And if nothing happens, you know, then that's okay. We prayed and we tried, and it'll be okay. But come and try. And he agreed, and he smoked the pipe. And he came, and we had an apartment at the time, and we created a ceremony room in the apartment. We took aluminum foil and put it over all of the windows to completely block out all of the light with electrical tape, and then put curtains in front of that so that we wouldn't see the shiny foil. And we made this room completely light tight. And we knew a fellow named Gary Whitelegs, who was a really good singer. And we asked Gary if he would come. And Steve gave him a drum that he gifted him for doing this singing. And Gary came, and Steve's came, and his wife and daughter. And we had Hindi and my daughter in the room. And Steve got everything ready, and he filled his pipe and gave it to his wife, Dina. And we turned out the lights, and Gary started singing the calling songs and singing the songs for the ceremony. And Steve's wife, Dina, thought this was all a bunch of hooey, you know, maybe faith healing or something. But as she was holding that pipe, she started to see these blue lights. And she said, and she just thought, this is my eyes playing tricks on me. However, she was holding that pipe out in front of her. And when those blue lights went, and she didn't see them, but when they disappeared behind the pipe and then came out the other side, she thought to herself, holy shit, this is real. Well, after that ceremony, Steve told us that the Spirit had said that Hindi's doctor used to believe in Grandfather Jesus, but he had lost his faith and now he just believed in science. And he said that the Spirit said that they're going to teach him a lesson. They said he'll still have his work to do. We're not going to take everything, but we're going to teach him something. And so, you know, we had the ceremony afterwards, and when on Tuesday, Hindi went in for our CT guided needle biopsy. And when they extracted what they thought was a tumor, all they could find were fat cells. They couldn't find any tumors in her liver at all. If they'd been there before, they had disappeared. Well, you know, Steve went on and did a number of other ceremonies and helped other people. You know, he never, word of what had happened kind of got out that Steve had done this ceremony, and it helped Hindi. And so other people started coming to him and asking him to pray for them. And he started getting a reputation. And I guess Tim and Gogi got really upset at him, thinking that he was faking all of this. I remember there was also one time when one of our friends, Bobby, had a daughter, and she was having health problems. And the doctors were getting really worried about her. They were drawing blood work on her, and it was looking really bad, and they didn't know why. And they were afraid they were going to lose her. And they couldn't figure out what it was, that her health was going down. And so when Steve went to visit Bobby, Bob said, Steve, I need to ask you to do a ceremony, for my daughter. And Steve said, oh, he said, the Spirit just came to me and he told me, he said, you don't need a ceremony. He said, just tell her to stop eating candy from the rattle. And Bobby said, eating candy from the rattle? What the heck is that? And Steve said, I don't know, but that was the message. Tell her to stop eating candy from the rattle and she'll be fine. And they're puzzling this when suddenly in the other room, they heard a, like a rattling sound. And they quickly opened the door, and his daughter had a bottle of ibuprofen, sugar-coated ibuprofen pills, and was shaking a couple of them out into her hand and was about to take them. And they said, stop. And they stopped her from taking them, and they asked her. And she had been dosing herself with ibuprofen several times a day for a long period of time. And it had never occurred to her to mention to the doctor that she was taking all this ibuprofen, because she just thought it was harmless stuff to be taking. And it turned out that all the health problems that she was having was because the ibuprofen that she had been taking was damaging her liver. And so she stopped taking the ibuprofen and her health came back. And so I always liked that story about the candy from the rattle. So, but so if you ever heard anything about Steve Lawrence, there was a lot of things said about him that were bad, but he really did make that connection. And, I liked him a lot.
Preston,
Yeah,
it's Cooley. Good afternoon.
good afternoon.
Hey, I know, with Sundance Clause, and that you're kind of tied to that Heoka spirit in somewhat, to a greater or lesser degree, I don't know. But I wondered if you could just talk about your how that came about and anything you'd like to share with us about that way.
Okay. Well, I have gone out in the Heoka rounds, and I hadn't specifically considered myself a Heoka. However, I have, when I've been up on the hill, I've been up on the hill during thunderstorms when the lightning was striking all around. Grandpa put me up on the hill near his house, and there was a thunderstorm that came in, and a lot of lightning was all around me. So maybe that's part of it. I don't talk backwards or feel especially called to try to behave like a Heoka or anything. I also went up on Bear Butte one time and fasted, and as I was standing on the end of Bear Butte, a thunderstorm came in and lightning was striking down. I could see down, and lightning was striking down lower on the butte than where I was standing. So, that was something. And when I started going to Pilot Rock, Shane kind of grabbed me and pulled me into the Heoka circle. And so I would go out during the clown rounds. And at one point I had an old man mask that I had on, and I was wearing a tutu, and I was going out, and I didn't know what I was going to do out there. And as I got into the south gate, there was this really tall stalk of a weed that was growing and had this end on it, really straight thing. And I thought, aha. And I grabbed this thing and stuffed it into my tutu. So I was going out with this stalk looking like a hard on, and I went around, and was messing with the other Heyokas, and I walked up and danced beside Michael Two Feathers, and he was trying to keep a straight face and not notice me, and I was saying, "Hey, big boy, do you want to stroke my stalk?" And he started laughing, and he couldn't help himself, and so I've it was also because at that time they had said that they were going to make the buffalo and the man that they hang up in the tree to have little tiny penises on them. And they said that that was because of the men that were misusing the powers. And I didn't think that that was, what that was about. And I felt like that energy needed to be brought back into it. And so that's why I think I got inspired with that stalk. But, I've helped out in the Heyoka rounds, and I thought when I grew a beard, I thought of being Santa Claus, since I kind of have the right shape for it. And I asked Paul one time when I came up and before dance, and I said to Paul, I said, "Hey, Paul, is it okay for me to have this beard on out there in the arbor?" And I said, because I want to do a Santa Claus thing, and I was meaning the Santa Claus thing come Christmas time, and because I do a Santa Claus for the a group that is it's called the Candle Lighters, and it's a support group for children with cancer and their families. And I'm the Santa Claus for that group. They have a winter meeting, and I come out, and Hindi and I would buy a whole bunch of toys, and we would give those out to these kids with cancer and to their brothers and sisters and family. So I asked Paul about that, because I was going to be Santa Claus, and he said, "Oh," he said, "well, if you're going to be Santa Claus during the Heyoka round, then you could keep, you could have special dispensation and keep the beard." And at that time, I wasn't prepared to be a Santa Claus during that Heyoka round, so I totally shaved the beard off that year before dance started. But then the next year, I brought my Santa Claus suit up, and Hindi helped me, and we got a whole bunch of toys to bring up to give away to the children. And so that's sort of how I ended up being Sundance Santa.
Thanks, Preston. That's exactly what Paul would say. I'm sure everybody would agree. The dispensation part.
Yeah. So I thought, okay, got it. I want to keep the beard. So I shaved it off that year, but then the next year I thought, all right, I'm going to get the special dispensation.
Thank you, Pesto.
Yeah,
Appreciate you sharing.
thank you.
Have a wonderful weekend. What's left of it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Pesto, so much. That was absolutely amazing. Mike and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This actually seemed kind of, I was very nervous about this. It seems like I actually would have had an easier time if I'd had you all in the room with me. It's tough when I'm the only one talking and everyone else is muted and I don't see anyone but myself in the picture frame. It's kind of disconcerting. I know everyone's there, but I didn't know, you know, I don't have any clues of anyone, you know, shaking their head or going, oh, okay. You know, so kind of.
Thank you, Pesto.
Thank you, Pesto. It was wonderful.
It was really wonderful.
I'm so happy to see that the recording button is going, and I saw it was going during the entire session, and I'm so happy to know that this will hopefully be archived and it's magical. We want to share it with our kids. We want our kids to be able to listen and refer back to hear these stories again and again, because they're, especially coming from you, and the interpretation is very rich. Thank you so much.
So you recorded it, Pesto?
I have recorded it.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. That was wonderful stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Pesto.
I don't know. This format actually worked pretty well for this, because you were able to go slow and take as much time as you needed, and we were all able to stay with you.
Well, thank you.
I could say lots more, but then my humility would be I would be losing my humility.
Say what you said.
Thank you all so much for.
Thank you, Pesto.
Oh.
Hey.
You all right? Yeah, all right. I am. Yeah, you're. Well, I think I'm just greasy. Just greasy? Yeah. I get greasy.
Thank you, Pesto. Thank you for your stories.
Thank you. Thank you
I
all
really
for coming.
appreciate your stories.
I'm just an oily skinned person.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Pesto.
Yeah, no, thanks for.
Thank you.
Oh, and we care about you.
Yes, to me.
Thank you so much for coming, for joining me.
You're welcome.
You ready? You all have a wonderful day. Be well.
Yes.
You as well.
Thank you.
Good seeing everybody.
Oh.
Hello.
Thank you, Pesto. Have a great afternoon. Bye, Marcy.
See you later, William.
Hey.
Yeah, couple hours maybe.
Hey, William.
All right. I guess.
Thanks, Pesto.
You bet. Thank you.
Always love hearing what you have to share. And I love the floating down the stream with you in your thoughts.
Yeah, a little disjointed, but thanks, Eileen. Love to you all.
Love to you as well.
Thanks, Preston. Hey, nice shirt, Carrick. Oh, it's a waistcoat.
Carrick, you're muted.
Oh, I can talk. It's a vest. I wanted to put a vest on, and it was good to hear these stories. I've been trying to think about if we were in person and coming to sit at these stories. I wanted to dress up for these stories, and it felt really good. And I thought it went really well, Dad. I thought it was not disjointed at all. It had that natural feeling and all your preparation. You've been compiling your stories, and I thought it was a real good run. Presenting it to the people the way that you did it was just perfect and beautiful and natural and spirit led, and then at the end there was able to be questions and bring back those stories of Steve and how you brought the grandpa's, not just about the miracle of the nail coming out of the throat, but the whole point about that is about the humility that he had, that he wouldn't tell that story himself, but be told about him. And then you were able to bring that teaching in. So really, that was beautiful. And that we have it preserved, because I want Hazel and Rowan and Tashi and to be able to listen to them again and again and again. And so thank you so much, everybody, for that we could have this day. Love you.
Thank you, Carrick. That was the most amazing thing, was that humility. It's the toughest thing, because, it feels like we want these ways to make us feel like we're connected and like we're strong and like but that's not how it is. That the more, when we become humbled, it actually, we get humiliated, and that actually brings us closer to the Creator. But it doesn't feel like it. We want something that makes us feel great, but that's not the way we get closer. The way we get closer is by going lower and then reaching out to the Creator that way. And it's a tough lesson. It's one I'm still trying to learn.
It was an interesting juxtaposition that you gave there, saying that when you think you're on track and things, you got to go, that's when it's the opposite what you think or feel. And so I wondered if you noticed that, any examples of that with Grandpa Fool's Crow or any of those other guys you were hanging out with.
Well, it was funny when I would walk in and Grandpa would look at me, and he would look at me and it would just kind of crack me open, like he could see right into the middle of me.
Yeah.
And I would start thinking to myself, okay, am I screwing up? Am I not praying enough? What's going on? And it was interesting that he would see that and just kind of peel that open. It's hard for me because I've been such a screw up my entire life. I feel like I've been gifted so much to have met these very special people and to have been shown so much that I feel like I need to try to figure a way to pass on what was shared with me so that it doesn't die with me when I die. Not that I'm expecting to die anytime soon, but I'm getting on in age now, and so I want to find a way to make sure that the blessings I was given are shared.
How is that How is your manuscript coming?
I'm working. See, part of one of the things I'm wanting to do, I'm working on a part of it about science. One of the medicine people gave a story that Ron Goodman told me about. And he said, all of our religions are like spokes on a wheel, and they all come into the sacred center where the Creator is, he said. And when you're on one of those spokes, if you move to the outside of that spoke, then you start worrying about who's holy and who's not, and you get judgmental, and you get caught up in your ego and all of that. He said, but if you move into the center, then it's all about love and compassion. He said, on the outside there, way on the outside, you have to hang on tight to your spoke because you'll get spun off. But when you get into the center, he said, it's all about love and compassion. And that from that center, you could see all of those other spokes, and you could walk around on all of those spokes and visit all those other religions without ever losing your connection to your religion. And so I liked to put that together with the teaching about the elephant and the blind men, where, you know, each blind man grabs a different part of the elephant, and one grabs the tusk and says an elephant's like a spear, and one grabs the tail and says an elephant's like a rope, and one grabs the leg and says the elephant's like a tree. And each of their perceptions is absolutely accurate and real, but it's still partial. And so I kind of see that all of our religions give us a different view into that center to our Creator, and that we need to, it's good to be able to recognize that, because we get a better view of our Creator when we experience through these different ways of believing and understanding. And I believe that science is one of those spokes on the wheel. What's more, I believe that there is a way to explain all of the spiritual things using scientific knowledge, and that is the part of my writing that I'm working on right now, is about how the scientific reality can be used to explain the spiritual things, and that, you know, the miracles of Jesus and of Grandpa Fool's Crow and all of these things, they're real, and there's a real reason for them, and that science can explain these things, but just not in the way that it thinks, you know, currently. And so I'm trying to approach that through the understanding of how science is dealing with who we are deep down inside. And anyway, that's the part of my writing that I'm working on right now, and we'll be glad to share once it's ready to share.
I was talking to a friend of mine recently who has a master's in engineering, and he was talking about engineering and biology and how there's a lot of parallels that they study. And I never thought of that before. But I think this is kind of part of what you're getting at here.
Well, you know, the world of science is a world of observation, you know, and it's based on what's observed. And I like that there's a story about the quantum mechanics. They do something called a dual slot experiment. And the dual slot experiment, they take these two slits or dual slit, and they shine a light through the slits. And they do this to try to figure out, is light a solid photon or is it a wave? And that was the big controversy. Which is it? And so now when the light goes through these tiny slits, it will refract. So when it goes through, it doesn't just go through in one direction. It actually, you know, comes apart and creates a pattern on the wall. And they found that with these two slits, when they would shoot the light through both of them, when as waves, when the waves would come out, they would interfere, they would start to cross over the other waves and would interfere, and they would create a pattern of lines based on the interference. And so then they tried slowing it down to where they were just putting through one photon or one thing at a time. And they were still, when they would start to see the collection of where these things hit, they were still seeing this wave pattern, or these slits, or the things to indicate that there was these waves. And so it is as if even as a single photon, it was still managing to split and go through both slots at the same time and interfere with itself and affect itself and land in these different areas, which was kind of mind-blowing. Then they did it with electrons, and then they started doing it with atoms, and they had the same results. So, and then they started doing it with molecules, including really complex molecules, up to 810 atoms, and firing them through these slits and doing it one at a time. even one atom at a time, they were still seeing this correlation of the interference patterns to indicate that the molecules are also a wave. They're not just a particle. And I've come to believe that the particles that we ourselves, our world around us, it is kept in a physical, solid reality by our egos. And when people like Grandpa Foolscrow and Dawson and so on can let their egos completely die, then they start to see, they can see and interact with the world as, and reality as waves instead of just as solid things. And so that's where that power comes from, because they're so completely without ego that they perceive the wave world around them, through which means, you know, they can do things and stuff that we can't even imagine, because they're dealing with a different reality. And I find that a lot of this has to do, a lot of the ego and stuff has to do with language, because our ego is built of language. And I find that if we go and fast on the hill, or we're meditating and we completely stop our internal language, our internal dialogue going on, and sit in total silence, because that's also a prayer. Sitting in silence and listening is a prayer, that when we do that, the world starts to change. Now for me, because I'm a dumb shit, you know, I'll sit in silence, and when I start to notice the world changing, that things kind of lose what they normally look like, that'll immediately start me thinking, wow, that's different, and so on, of course, and it all goes away. You know, but I think that's part of what we need to do when we go on the hill, because we think of prayer as us either verbally out loud or even just silently to ourselves, but we think of ourselves as talking to the Creator, you know, either out loud or silently, like we've got the words we're sending to the Creator. But there should be a part of it that is also considered prayer, where we listen, where we shut up the thoughts, we shut up, you know, our words, and we sit in that total silence without the words, so that if Spirit has something it wants to give us, you know, we can do that. It can do that. But it's a tough place to be, to sit in that silence, because a lot of what falls away from us is our beliefs about ourselves, because those beliefs are all built up out of words and what we think about ourselves. And so I think that's why it helps us to try to humble ourselves down, and not, you know, to try to grasp that painful humility that is so humiliating, because it gives us the ability to sit in that silence and open up to the world that is the spirit world. So
I think that that listening part requires the brain to basically be turned off, to be able to hear. And also, when you're getting that information and you're seeing these things, and you go, wow, that's it, you know, like it's like you're trying to interpret and translate it into some way you can explain it to other people in your brain, and that's what shuts off the flow.
yeah. As soon as we try to understand it, we're lost, because
just let it go. Let it ride.
It's all language. Yes, exactly.
Let it ride.
When you were talking, I was imagining myself down at the river with my belly on the ground, like on the level of the water. That's a great teaching that you gave. I don't know when it was, but I think of that often. It's like getting on the level of the water. That's a good one for me.
Yeah, I know I'm still caught up in my own ego, but I think it's just because I'm kind of a motor mouth internally, you know. I'm a daydreamer, and I'm always thinking of crap, you know, and so hard time silencing myself and sitting in silence. It's a practice I need to do a great deal more of.
I kind of wonder if your desire to reconcile the spirit world with the scientific world is doomed.
Hey, so long, everybody. Ciao. Thanks.
Take care, Dave.
Good to see everybody. Bye.
See you, Dave. Take care, man.
Will do.
Yeah, well, I don't think that it's doomed, because I think there is a real connection. I think it all has to do with understanding the nature of the ego and how the ego evolved in us human beings. And I believe it evolved as a function of language. It's odd, but for me, I was raised an Episcopalian, which I didn't think much of. And, when it became all science derived, but I view the book of Genesis now very differently than most people do, because the original sin for me wasn't eating an apple, nor was it disobeying. The original sin was the fruit that was eaten was the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And that what I see that as representing is that when we gained language, when we human beings evolved language, we started building a structure of understanding based on language. And we were living in societies, and it became important for us to be in the societies because, we're kind of screwed if we're all by ourselves. It helps having other people around us. And so the importance of being a part of a society made it so that with our language, we defined ourselves to ourselves as being good and worthy of inclusion in our societies. And that because of that, we create these ego selves where we define ourselves in terms of being worthy and wonderful and so on. And it's not realistic. It separates us from the reality and separates us from who we are down deep inside. And who we are down deep inside isn't bad, and it's certainly lovable, but it's something we're afraid of. We're afraid to face that. And I think part of what happens when people go on the hill and finally reach that point where they let go of their own expectation of themselves and can then become opened up because they don't need the language anymore that was defining themselves to themselves. I'm sorry if that seems a bit rambling there.
No, but it's interesting that the people that you talk about, like Fool's Crow or Dawson and those folks, it sounds like they very infrequently used language, Lakota or otherwise. In other words, they didn't talk very much.
Grandpa would often be very quiet. Dawson was a minister, and so he was used to preaching and talking. And there was one time when in the ceremony, we were in the Uipi ceremony, and Dawson was tied up in the blanket, and his daughter-in-law was praying, and she choked on the word Tankashila, and just came out Tankashi, and Tankashi is the Lakota word for father-in-law. And so Dawson went, how? And everyone realized that she had said Tankashi instead of Tankashila, and so the whole ceremony house just cracked up, and everyone was laughing, for like 2 minutes. And I was like, what? what, what's, and then somebody explained it to me that she had said Tankashi, and that actually was who Dawson was. And like, it was like she was praying to Dawson. And so he made a big joke out of it. So it was very funny. But Dawson was not someone who he would talk. Grandpa was a little more quiet, but Grandpa, I would go with Grandpa I would be his driver. I would take him to treaty meetings and things. And it was always really amazing because there would be all these young headmen in this treaty meeting. Now it was all Lakota. So, I didn't have any idea. I don't know enough Lakota I know a few words and I can follow sometimes a little bit, but it would be all these young men standing up, or younger men standing up and, making these points and being very animated and so on. And then at the very end of the meeting, Grandpa Foolscrow would stand up, and he would say, he would start talking very gently. And all of these young men, and when Grandpa would, motion to them, and like, they would all put their heads down, like, oh, and whatever Grandpa said, when Grandpa was done talking, no one else had anything to say. It was like, that was it. What Grandpa said, just kind of like that was the end of the meeting. That was the thing. And then I would take Grandpa home, after we get a meal or something, and he'd go back in with Grandma, and he'd start telling her what was going on. And Grandma started telling Grandpa stuff, and Grandpa put his head down. Seriously, Grandpa, very respectfully, he listened to that old lady. He trusted her, and and she started telling him about what for the next meeting the next day or something, and he just respectfully put his head down and listened to her very, very carefully. So, I saw that a number of times, and it was very impressive.
It was ultimately Grandma that had the ultimate last word.
Yeah, Grandma had something to say. Grandpa would listen very respectfully, the same way that the young men had listened respectfully when Grandpa spoke.
I hope those edits I sent you on your manuscript helped a little bit.
Yes. Yes.
I think your next step is hiring a professional editor to give it a read and make edits. I mean, you may not be there yet. I know how that goes.
I lost my favorite editor recently. So.
Oh. Yeah. That was Hindi.
That was Hindi, yeah, because she was an English teacher, and and also was into technique analysis of language and language structure and everything. So he was really good, but I miss her for that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I hope that you can get your work out to being published so other people can hear the stories.
My intention, though, is that because of the ethic of the medicine people, that they should never charge whatever the creator gives you for free. You should never charge money for.
Well, you can have the money accrue to some nonprofit.
Yeah, but for me, the thing is, what I will do is I will put it online and make it available. Now, if somebody wants to put it into a book after it's online and free for anyone to download, that's fine. I don't care about that. But what I was given needs to be offered free of charge, because that was how it was given to me. Nobody ever asked me to pay for that. The creator never. So, not that it's a gift to me from the creator, but I feel like all of I've been blessed to witness all of this, and I feel it's important to share as best I can.
You mean you're not going to take it on a big workshop tour and make billions of dollars? And
yeah, yeah.
I appreciate it. I know Hindi would be really has been present in observing these things and however that works, and would be really happy that we're able to hear these things and have that recording button even still on, capturing these for our children. And she's always been so, had the kids at the forethought, and your work with children and the Girl Scouts and all of our kids can and now have these stories, and is still editing right now with us, and is here she doing the editing right here. And I love you, Dad. I'm going to step off too, and thanks so much for a wonderful afternoon of storytelling and for us having the chance to just listen to you and be muted, and for you to have the floor is a really gift to us. So thanks for stepping up and stepping out and offering that for us to receive from you and from Hindi and your experiences with Grandma and Grandpa and Dawson and uncles and aunties. We love you so much. Thank you. Doksha.
Okay.
Wopila.
Oh, thank you.
Love you.
Love you too.
Preston, where does your daughter live?
My daughter lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband. They met in Oregon State University. She had been dating his roommate, and his roommate broke up with her. And then he asked his roommate, said, "Hey, if you broke up with her, is it okay if I ask her out?" And so her husband is Alden, and he was into engineering and physics and optics. And he went to University of Rochester and got his PhD in optics, and now is working for NASA on the James Webb Space Telescope. He's working out of the Goddard Space Institute, which is in the DC area. And so that's where they're living. And she is working online for a company that's in California. And she's been doing that for a while.
Have any grandchildren?
No, I wish we did, but, and they're open to it, but they don't seem like they're coming, so.
Yeah. How old is your daughter?
Well, she was born, I think she's 36 now. Yeah, 36, I believe.
Now, Mike and I have one child, a son, who's 31 now, and also no grandchildren so far.
Yeah, I would kill for grandchildren, but that's okay. It is what it is. And
yeah. Are you living down in Medford?
I am.
Uh-huh.
I'm in my house. I'm hunkered down, and
I feel like I've turned into this, like, what's the word? Cloyed. I don't know the right word. Like I'm almost a hermit.
Yeah.
Oh, too.
Me too.
I mean, I do go outside to walk,
yeah,
you know, with masks in the neighborhood. But other than that, I pretty much don't leave the house.
Yeah.
And that's so bizarre too, because this has been going on. We got home March 1st because we came from Hawaii.
Yeah.
We're there for 2 months usually every year. And we got home, the pandemic had started up right before we got home. So we knew that there was a visitor, an unwelcome visitor in our midst. But wow, I never thought I'd be sitting here in October having lived through 7 months, 9 months, I guess.
Yeah.
9 months of isolation. So
it's tough.
It is hard.
Yeah, and it's going to be quite a bit more, but
I think we have a long way to go, unfortunately.
I think
so. Well, hey, thank you so much for sharing this. You had a really good turnout. The one story I didn't hear you talk about, you must have a whole slew of stories that you just kind of pull out of your back pocket every now and then.
I try to remember them, you know, and then of course in a situation like this, they all flee, you know. It's like, oh, wait, what was I going to say?
There was one that you told, and I'd like to hear it sometime, maybe not today, but it's one of my favorite stories I've ever heard you tell about it involved a Yaweepy and a flashlight and a boot.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there was one of Godfrey Chips's Yaweepies, and I heard this story, and there was, they had everyone take all their shoes off before the start of the Yaweepy, and everyone just threw all of their shoes and boots and stuff into a corner. And so everyone's sitting, you know, barefooted or with their socks on around the thing, and they turned out the lights. And there's this one fellow who thought, you know, he thought he knew that when the spirit supposedly was coming in, it was really just Godfrey getting up and going around and doing all this stuff. And so he decided he was going to show everyone. So he had a flashlight in his pocket, and he was going to wait until the spirit was moving around. Then he was going to pull this flashlight out and turn it on and shine it and show everyone that it was really just Godfrey doing all of this all along. And so the spirit's going around the room and everything, and he starts to reach into his pocket, and as soon as his finger touches the flashlight, pow, this thing smashes his nose, and he feels his nose break and feels blood coming down and everything. And this thing lands in his lap, and he's just knocked half silly, and he leaves the flashlight alone, you know. And then, you know, he's sure his nose is broken. And then when it was all done and they turned the lights back on, his own boot from out of the pile of shoes was what had hit him in the face and was sitting in his lap. And after the ceremony, there was no sign that his nose was damaged. There was no blood, you know.
Wow.
He was just fine. But
were you in this particular?
I was not in this. It was a story I heard. Another story I heard was that there was a man who had some PTSD issues, and he had talked about going into the ceremony, into the Yaweepy, and he was, the person told me this was someone who sat next to him, and he was very nervous about whether, you know, he would be able to keep his cool when lights were out and everything was dark, you know. And my friend told me he was sitting next to him, and that when the lights were out and the spirit was going around, his friend got agitated and was starting to get really upset. This ceremony was taking place in a basement that was below grade. You know, was down. I might have had some windows high up that would be out at near just above ground level on the outside, but those of course were covered up and everything. But the basement was all sealed up and darkened. And this guy was starting to get agitated, and my friend said suddenly he wasn't there. It's like, because he was sitting right next to him, and suddenly he was gone. And from his perspective, what happened was he was there, and the PTSD was starting to really get him upset, and suddenly he found himself sitting in the yard outside of the ceremony house, just looking up, and there's stars and trees around him, and, you know, stuff that he had suddenly just, boom, was sitting in the yard from having been sitting next to this guy on the bench who witnessed him suddenly gone. So that was like pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, no,
you know, that to me is like proof that when these medicine people make this connection, they can affect reality in a way where what is solid is no longer solid. And so they could move him, boom, just outside through the walls and stick him in the backyard and have him go, what the heck, you know? So I can't hear you.
Heard that one before.
You haven't heard that one before,
No,
huh?
no.
Yeah, it always blows my mind, the things that happen. They used to say that Grandpa Foolscrow could pull a feather out of the air. I didn't witness this, or if I witnessed it, I didn't connect or whatnot, that he could just reach up and pull an eagle feather out of the air, out of non-existence or from another reality or from another place or whatever. But I don't doubt that that's possible. It sounds pretty phenomenal, but I've witnessed enough things that are so miraculous and so different that, that would not have surprised me even a bit. But the thing that's always blew my mind the most was his utter humility and his quietness. And I had trouble reading his books because, I know the spirits told him that he had to tell the stories of what had happened and had Dallas Chief Eagle translate for him. And so it wasn't coming from a place of ego for him to say, I did this and I did that, but it's just tough to hear him saying that, how I did this and how I did that, because that was so unlike him to ever talk. I had wished he would, but because I would have loved to have heard the stories from him, but he never talked about those things when I was with him. It's kind of funny. I would have loved to have learned Lakota, but I just sort of felt like I can't ask this head chief and medicine man to waste his time teaching some Damwashichu Lakota language. But when we would sit down at the dinner table, I would ask him the names of things, food, and got to know all of the names of things. And Dawson one time teased me in front of the ceremony house before Uipi that, he said, Pesto, you've learned all of the names of all of the food. And so, I said, if the Washichus ask you to say a prayer in Lakota, you could say, Ahoyapi was Zizipila, Wakayapi, and list off all the names of food and say amen at the end of it. And they would go, oh, wow, that was a really good prayer, So that was
salt, pepper, knife, fork.
Minisquia, Yuminumunu, Happy, and it just so that was
When did he die?
89. And
Really?
Dawson before that, Dawson died around 82, I think. I'd have to check. But
What time of year was it that he crossed,
Grandpa Foolscrow? I don't remember. I could look it up.
That's right. Well, it's been a delightful afternoon.
Thank you so much, Linda.
You did a great job.
Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
All right.
Hopefully we'll be able to be in each other's presence eventually in a sweat lodge.
I would like that very much. Yeah.
I haven't been in a lodge for so long, I don't even remember.
I know, me, the same. I'm the same way. I know some people think like, oh, we're gonna try to do a lodge, but mostly everyone's not doing it unless it's just with their immediate family.
Yeah, we have in our backyard, we have it's basically a cedar box, one room building that we have a sauna in, a wood burning sauna.
Oh, nice.
We get to sweat, which is nice, but
Yes.
it's not quite the same as a lodge, right?
Yeah. That's sweet. That's good.
Okay, well, until we meet again.
Yes, Doksha. Kewachia Kink Dalo. I'll see you again later.
Yeah. Oh, did you see, by the way, I just was going to mention, Yogesh turned me on to the movie called The Dakota 38.
No, I don't think I saw that.
Hey, I think you'd really enjoy it. It's a documentary about what happened in Manitou, Michigan, back in 18, I forget, 18, is it 62, 72? Anyway, it's available online. So if you were to Google Dakota 38 movie,
Okay.
it's on YouTube.
All right. I'll check it out.
And it's a historical documentary. Very.
So when they hung those Lakotas,
Mhm.
God, that
Yeah.
doesn't
Well,
sound
it's
like.
also about the people that are who are part of the. I think the reservation was it the Rosebud or Pilot or Pine Ridge? Anyway, they're the guy he had a vision basically, and in modern day, and that vision was of what happened, and they talk about the importance of the horse and how the horse has connections to the 6 sacred directions, and that they needed to do I think it was like a 300-mile ride in the middle of winter to get there on time, because the hanging was on December 26th. And they went on an anniversary, and it was about healing and reconciliation, which there's a lot of that has to happen in this country with a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, well, I'll let you go.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
Take care of yourself.
Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.